Hey, all, Scott Horton here. It's always safe to say that one should keep at least some of your savings in precious metals as a hedge against inflation. And if this economy ever does heat back up and the banks start expanding credit, rising prices could make metals a very profitable bet. Since 1977, Robertson Roberts Brokerage Inc. has been helping people buy and sell gold, silver, platinum, and palladium, and they do it well. They're fast, reliable, and trusted for more than 35 years. And they take Bitcoin. Call Robertson Roberts at 1-800-874-9760 or stop by rrbi.co. All right, you guys, welcome back. I'm Scott Horton. It's my show, Scott Horton Show, here on the Liberty Radio Network, live on the weekdays, noon to 2 Eastern Time. ScottHorton.org, etc., like that. All right, next up is first up today, Jeff Bachman. He is Professor of Human Rights and Co-Director of Ethics, Peace, and Global Affairs at American University's School of International Service. And he's the author of this article at Common Dreams, Revisiting the Humanitarian Intervention in Libya. Welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Very happy to have you here. And I'm happy to say that there's a little bit of revisionist history finally coming out about the Libya war, reminding people about just what happened there and providing a bit of context. But I'm happy to say that yours really stands out among them as far as, well, I just like the way, which arguments you make and how you incorporate them here. It's a very good job you did.
Thank you.
Revisiting the humanitarian, quote-unquote, their ironic quotes, intervention in Libya. Again, commondreams.org here. And I guess today's the day, right? 5 years ago today, you write March 17, 2011, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1973, authorizing what exactly? I'll ask you in just a second, but the point there being that under international law, under the UN Charter, it's illegal to start a war unless the UN Security Council says that you can, and that's what happened, sorta, or not?
Sort of. I mean, it authorized, the use of military force or all necessary means for the protection of the civilian population of Libya. And I should note there that it did not specify civilian supporters of the rebels or of the Gaddafi regime, which I think is another element that I didn't include in my piece, which we can always come back to, is that the intervention was more concerned with supporting the rebels and therefore also protecting the supporters of the rebels, whereas the Gaddafi supporters, who have every right to their right to life and physical integrity and everything else, whose lives I don't think were seen as important as the others. But go back to the question, the argument that I make is that the intervention clearly exceeded the mandate and also went beyond anything that could be described as, again, quote-unquote, humanitarian intervention. And at that point, once you exceed the mandate of what was authorized, then you actually are stepping into the area of an act of aggression.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me ask you about back then, if you remember or if you have facts that you could report about back then. Was there really any, denial of this fact back then at the time? Because certainly on this show, it was easy to see the logical dominoes that fall down. It's only a matter of, 2 + 2 = 4 here. If the people of Benghazi are not safe from Gaddafi, then that means from, the interventionist logic, they never will be until Gaddafi is gone. And so a vote to protect them with a no-fly zone is a vote for regime change in Tripoli. As simple as that. It was obvious in the first place, wasn't it?
Sure. And this actually got, the intervention itself connects to sort of the responsibility to protect movement. And, this is an issue that, say, R2P advocates and scholars have sort of tackled with is regime change also justified under R2P? Is it only for civilian protection? And then it gets at the question, if the regime intends to, kill civilians, then to protect them, is the change in regime necessary? But I think a related question is, whether Gaddafi was actually, I don't want, just to head off some of the, sympathizer type, statements that some might say, I'm not in any way condoning Gaddafi's rule. But the facts on the ground appear to show that he was not indiscriminately attacking civilians, and that he was actually dealing with a violent uprising, one that was maybe peaceful for the first couple of days, And that also, his threats were aimed at the rebels in Benghazi. And then, I quoted Cooperman in my piece, Alan Cooperman, who's at Texas A&M, who wrote about how, the number of civilians that were killed in Misrata before the intervention occurred, it doesn't demonstrate indiscriminate use of force or intentional targeting of civilians. So if NATO/US, if the intervention was actually under false pretenses, as Cooperman argues, then right from the start, we're actually the humanitarian, justification for the war does not stand.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think we know from reporting by Jeffrey Scott Shapiro and Kelly Rodella in the Washington Times from a year ago that the CIA and the DIA told Hillary Clinton and Obama and the administration in no uncertain terms that the whole Benghazi casus belli was fake, and they went along with it anyway.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I quote that one email that we've seen released where I forget what the individual's name was, but writing to at the time Secretary of State Clinton that the humanitarian justification was of a limited nature and is in the past at this point. And this was at the end of March. So we know within 2 weeks Benghazi had been secured, or the security had been provided, but the intervention continued, and NATO, 1973, the resolution built off of Resolution 1970, which already called for an arms embargo, and members of NATO, armed the rebels. As I noted in my piece, by middle of May, 14,000 airstrikes had been launched. This was not civilian protection. This was clearly, an act of war on behalf of the rebels in Libya.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this. I'm no lawyer. That's the other Scott Horton, has all the law degrees and everything like that. But it seems to me like if a president says that he started a war based on a 51 to 49% shrug, then that in itself is admissions of war crimes, is it not? To start a war based on what almost half of you is willing to admit is not a good enough reason.
Sure. I don't want to call that specifically a war crime, but what I would say is, it sounds again to me like what I'm arguing, which is it's launching a war of aggression, which is itself is a crime.
Yeah. But isn't that an admission? That sounds to me like an admission. I barely decided to do it, but then Hillary said, "Come on," so I said, "All right."
Right, I was coaxed into it
yeah.
To begin with, and then to now in this recent Atlantic piece to blame it on Europe. It's pretty disingenuous to go and say, well, I thought they would deal with the aftermath. Well, we can't even deal with the aftermath until we talk honestly about the intervention itself, and then certainly if you look at what Libya became in the immediate aftermath of the intervention, and certainly what we see now. There's arguably a failed state, and whether Gaddafi again was a good ruler or not, the state of Libya would be a very different place today if the intervention had not gone forward.
Yeah. Well, and back to the timeline, because, it's pretty easy, for a Clinton defender to say, yeah, hindsight 2020, this, that, and the other thing. But as you mentioned, and it's made clear in your article here, you have the date. It's March 27th of 2011. And there is Sidney Blumenthal informing Clinton that, one rebel commander told me his troops continue to summarily execute all foreign mercenaries in the fighting. And by foreign mercenaries, of course, they mean any blacks that they capture.
Right, migrant workers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is March. So, and again, back to the Washington Times series, we know that there were ongoing efforts by the CIA and the military to thwart the State Department and try to negotiate, but that she refused. Even, once the war started, hey, FDR would say, unconditional surrender, man. We don't stop until Gaddafi is, violated and shot in the side of the head.
Absolutely, and as I noted in my piece, and when there was multiple ceasefires that were rejected. Again, if this was supposed to be a humanitarian intervention, whether or not they believed Gaddafi would, hold himself to any agreed upon ceasefire, they didn't even give him a chance. They rejected it. The African Union put forth another ceasefire opportunity that was based on the what was being called for in the Resolution 1973. That would have been the humanitarian thing to do, was at least give it an opportunity.
Right. All right, hold it right there, y'all. We got to take this break. We'll be right back with Jeff Bachman. He's a professor at American University and wrote this piece revisiting the humanitarian intervention in Libya at commondreams.org. It's a really good one. Go check it out. We'll be right back.
So you're a libertarian, and you don't believe the propaganda about government awesomeness you were subjected to in 4th grade. You want real history and economics. Well, learn in your car from professors you can trust with Tom Woods' Liberty Classroom. And if you join through the Liberty Classroom link at scotthorton.org, we'll make a donation to support The Scott Horton Show. Liberty Classroom, the history and economics they didn't teach you.
I love Bitcoin, but there's just something incredibly satisfying about having real, fine silver in your pocket. That's why commodity discs are so neat. They're 1-ounce rounds of fine silver with a QR code on the back. Just grab your smartphone's QR reader, scan the coin, and you'll instantly get the silver spot price in Federal Reserve notes and Bitcoin. And if you donate $100 to the Scott Horton Show, he'll send you one. Learn more at facebook.com/commoditydiscs. commoditydiscs.com.
All right, you guys, welcome back to the show here. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Jeff Bachman. He's got this article at commondreams.org. We're running it on antiwar.com today as well. Revisiting the humanitarian intervention in Libya. Well, we're linking to it. I don't mean we just lifted it. Revisiting the humanitarian intervention in Libya. And at the break there, you were talking about the many ceasefires. And I guess I would try to allow you to get back to that if you could, Jeff. You talk about real efforts by the African Union to create what they call a humanitarian corridor here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And South Africa put forward a proposal also. I mean, the thing about the ceasefires that I find interesting is the United States and NATO explicitly rejected, and I don't understand. It's hard for me to understand why they would have a say in whether to reject a ceasefire or not. They were authorized to use force for civilian protection. If ceasefire offers are on the table, I think that really should be something that's coordinated through the United Nations if we are going to have an intergovernmental organization that's supposed to maintain international peace and security. But instead, U.S. and NATO rejected these ceasefire, which, again, I think plays into what I'm arguing is that this is a war of aggression. They chose not to take these ceasefire opportunities, or at least to call Gaddafi's bluff if they thought that he would ultimately violate them.
Yeah. Well, and of course, one of the major problems about getting to the bottom of any of these things is that there's no real partisan interest in it because, all the Rubios of the Republican Party, of course, supported the Libya war. I guess Cruz didn't, but he doesn't want to make a campaign issue out of it now for whatever reason. And Trump claims he was good on it, but actually demanded war in Libya at the time, when you go back to the record. So there's basically no one who really wants to go after what happened here. Maybe Trump to a certain degree, but he doesn't have any of the rest of politics behind him on that, right? There's nobody in Congress wants to hold these hearings or anything like that. Because this was just the Democrats acting like the Republicans here.
Right. I mean, without someone like Dennis Kucinich who was very vocally opposed to this and was, involved in hearings, especially when we started invoking the War Powers Act. There's really, I mean, Hillary Clinton still gets to claim that, Libya, the intervention was a success. And, just to throw out a few other names, I don't think we can talk about those behind this and coaxing Obama into this without also mentioning Samantha Power and Susan Rice, who are also very active in pushing for this intervention.
And Gail Smith as well, right? She hardly ever gets the headlines, but she's one of the screeching Valkyries of war up there. It's funny the way everybody always says, well, of course, the women obviously will be the doves when, in fact, they all seem to be having a contest to prove what right-wingers they are. If you go back to, and there's multiple reporting about this, it's almost kind of unbelievable in a way if you think of it like a skit where in the Oval Office they really had the meeting where all the women were on one side baying for blood, and all of the men, including the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and all of them were saying, don't do it. And Obama sided with Hillary and Samantha Power and Susan Rice over the Republic. And just think of the political excuse there. Hey, my Republican Secretary of Defense warned me not to do it. That's all he needs to protect his right flank there. Gates said don't do it. But instead he goes for it anyway, listening to these well, I don't know. What are they? Are they true believers in this R2P thing? Or are they just front men for Lockheed? Or where do these people come from?
I think one quick thing I would note, in terms of no-fly zone in Libya and also, in Syria, the Department of Defense and the Pentagon have basically said you can't just provide a no-fly zone without actually something steamrolling into essentially a war, because to enforce that no-fly zone would be you'd have to shoot down potentially, say, Syrian planes or Libyan planes, and that of course would constitute an act of war. The other thing I was going to say is, I think it's really more a neoliberal agenda type thing. There's Samantha Power, of course, has A Problem from Hell, her book on genocide, and it's all based around war for human rights. And there are people out there like Mary Ellen O'Connell, who's a law professor at Notre Dame, who is big on the peace agenda and actually talked a lot about how the intervention in Libya actually probably caused more harm than good, in the sense that, had Gaddafi just been, won the civil war, it would have been over very quickly. Instead, by dragging it out, more people died on both sides of the civil war, as well as obviously civilians who got caught up in the civil war.
And we're just at the end of the first quarter of
where
this
human
thing.
rights can be protected through bombing campaigns. Kosovo was, maybe the first example in 1999, where it's like, we're not going to put any of our people at risk. We're just going to drop bombs, and that's going to protect human rights.
Right. And it's interesting, in that one, they at least lied, but claimed that 100,000 people had been killed. And then in this case, they said, well, 100,000 people will be killed. Trust us.
Right. Right, and I mean, even the numbers that they were saying before the intervention happened were extremely inflated. I mean, at this point, there's actually a New York Times article, probably from like September or October 2011, that said, like, where are all the dead bodies? And not to trivialize those who were killed, but they're saying that the total number of people killed was probably between 5,000 and 10,000 during the entirety of the uprising and then the intervention, whereas they were claiming over 1,000 people killed within the first few days of the uprising. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, numbers were very inflated, and that actually brings up another quote from the piece that I wrote. In the New York Times, again, 4 days after Resolution 1973 was authorized, David Kirkpatrick wrote that the rebels feel no loyalty to the truth in shaping their propaganda, making vastly inflated claims of Gaddafi's barbaric behavior. I mean, again, these things we knew very early on, but it never entered into the mainstream narrative. And I think that's really problematic. When U.S. foreign policy issues are the topic of discussion, the primary mainstream media can bring up in a story things like that, but then all the other stories, it totally omit that from them. Right. And so it becomes a form of propaganda,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, it's just like Jeffrey Goldberg's piece, where he starts out saying, Assad did the sarin attack, Assad did the sarin attack, and all through the article he says, Assad did the sarin attack, and then, here's this one little anecdote where the director of national intelligence told the president, I refuse to stand by that assertion. Oh, okay, thanks. But meanwhile, Assad did the sarin attack, Assad did the sarin attack. Same as always.
Right.
But yeah, and so the other thing is that we also know from all the reporting at the time that there hardly was a civil war at all. It was Western special forces and air power and a few Al-Qaeda guys on the ground fighting this war. The guys from, the Libyan veterans of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group and Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and Ansar al-Sharia and JSOC. They were the ones who were fighting this war. So, and that's even in the emails as well. There's, even at the time, the reporters calling in from the front on this show were saying there's not really any rebels around. There's more reporters than rebels on the front lines here, Yeah,
and as we know, those who were fighting or who NATO was supporting were committing crimes throughout the duration and then in the immediate aftermath. So that I think that's telling as well. Doctors Without Borders in January of 2012 left Libya because basically elements of the rebels were bringing them people who they had tortured, and then having Doctors Without Borders give them medical attention, and then they'd take them and torture them again. Doctors Without Borders realized, wait, we just aided this person, and now this person's back with similar physical ailments. So there was the summary executions that that you mentioned from the email. I mean, Another quick note in terms of how early we knew this, David Zucano from the LA Times had written on March 24th, rebel forces are detaining anyone suspected of serving or assisting Gaddafi regime, locking them up in the same prisons once used to detain and torture Gaddafi's opponents. And he goes on to talk about how it seems like they're using the same methods that they were supposedly fighting against. And again, so that was a week into the intervention itself, and yet we continue to support these rebels.
Yeah. Now, I think the miracle here is that the massive invasion and staying forever that Hillary Clinton promises to begin as soon as she's sworn in, she invoked, of course, Germany, Japan, and Korea as the Libya model to follow just the other day. And but it seems like a miracle it's taken this long. Like I thought, well, geez, it was obvious that if they get rid of Gaddafi, they're destroying the entire state, what exists of a real state in Libya, and they're going to have to start over from scratch. And the only way to do that is to invade and occupy the place in purple-fingered elections and build up an army and this exact same, Iraq-style catastrophe. And yet it looks like that's the way they're going now because they fought a war for Al-Qaeda guys who now declare their loyalty to the Islamic State. And so now they're gearing up and already doing missions there and are gearing up for more in Libya right now. So we're only at the end of chapter 1 of this thing, it looks like, Jeff.
That's right. We're militarily involved in Libya again. And, after the intervention and Gaddafi was executed, we wiped our hands of it. There was calls for investigations. There was calls for greater support and help and build the capacity in Libya. If I recall correctly, some of the things that were said in response were, the National Transitional Council would ask us if they want us to do those things. So suddenly, sovereignty didn't matter when it was time to overthrow Gaddafi. But then once he was overthrown, it was like, well, we have to give them their sovereignty and let them figure it out themselves. And of course, as you mentioned, we know how that turned out.
Yeah, well, and I wouldn't have expected them to do a better job of it than the Libyans that they left it to, as far as that goes. But it just goes to show that, their plan was, well, it'll probably work out or something, or if not, then that's fine too. We'll just have another war and go save the people that we put in danger.
Right. Just as success was initially, called when we deposed Saddam Hussein, and just as as soon as Gaddafi was dead, it was like that's a success. I mean, there's that footage of Hillary Clinton laughing, saying something like, "We came, we saw, he died," or or something like that, and making essentially like a joke out of the situation.
Yep. And tens of thousands are dead since then, at least. All right, listen, I'm sorry I kept you way over time. I got to go, you got to go, but thank you very much for your time, Jeff. Appreciate it.
That's great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Have a good one.
You too. All right, that's Jeff Bachman. Read this one. It's really good. It's at Common Dreams, Revisiting the Humanitarian Intervention in Libya. Will Grigg in 1 sec. Hey, y'all, Scott Horton here for WallStreetWindow.com. Mike Swanson knows his stuff. He made a killing running his own hedge fund and always gets out of the stock market before the government-generated bubbles pop. Which is, by the way, what he's doing right now, selling all his stocks and betting on gold and commodities. Sign up at WallStreetWindow.com and get real-time updates from Mike on all his market moves. It's hard to know how to protect your savings and earn a good return in an economy like this. Mike Swanson can help. Follow along on paper and see for yourself. WallStreetWindow.com. Hey, all, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new ebook by longtime Future Freedom author Scott McPherson. Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. This is the definitive principled case in favor of gun rights and against gun control. America is exceptional. Here the people come first, and we refuse to allow the state a monopoly on firearms. Our liberty depends on it. Get Scott McPherson's Freedom and Security, the Second Amendment and the Right to Keep and Bear Arms on Kindle at Amazon.com today. Hey, I'll check out the audiobook of Lew Rockwell's Fascism versus Capitalism, narrated by me, Scott Horton, at Audible.com. It's a great collection of his essays and speeches on the important tradition of liberty. From medieval history to the Ron Paul Revolution, Rockwell blasts our statist enemies, profiles our greatest libertarian heroes, and prescribes the path forward in the battle against Leviathan. Fascism versus Capitalism by Lew Rockwell for audiobook. Find it at Audible, Amazon, iTunes, or just click in the right margin of my website at scotthorton.org.